case you haven't noticed, Christmas is going to be just a few days away. So this is our Sunday here before Christmas, and it reminds me of this story. There was a guy who, he only ever came to church around Christmas time. And he comes to church one day, just before Christmas. And when the services are over, he walks out towards the back, and people are shaking hands and talking. And one guy walks up to him and says, "Brother, I'm concerned about you." He said, "You need to be in the army of the Lord, brother." The guy says, "Well, I am in the army of the Lord." He says, "Well, if you're in the army of the Lord, why do you only come around Christmas time?" The guy looks around and says, "I'm in the Secret Service." But I do want to wish everybody a Merry Christmas, and we're happy to have everybody here. I think it's great and wonderful that this time of year people are focused on the birth of Jesus. I think anytime people are thinking about Christ, that's a good thing. I hope, though, that we understand that Jesus being born on this earth was not a last-minute plan by God, but it was reality. It was God's plan from the very beginning. In Genesis chapter 3, when we read about Adam and Eve sinning, the very first sin that was ever committed, a lot of drastic things happen there. Of course, God casts them from the garden and things like that. But there is hope that God gives them. In Genesis 3, verse 15, God promises Eve, He says that you will have a seed, in other words, a descendant, who will come from you, and he will crush the head of the serpent. You're going to have a descendant who comes one day, and he's going to defeat the devil. Now, I don't know if Eve fully understood what that meant when God said it to her, but looking back, we understand what that meant. He's talking about Jesus. Jesus eventually was going to come, and he was going to bring victory over the devil. In 1 John 3, verse 8, John said that Jesus came that he might destroy the works of the devil. Jesus is the fulfillment of that prophecy. So there at the very beginning, God told Adam and Eve that Christ was going to come from them. So here's what we're going to do today for our lesson. I want you to see how it is that Jesus did come from Adam and Eve. What we're going to do here today is we're going to trace the seed line or the lineage of Jesus across the entire Old Testament and bring it into the New Testament. So I want to take you to Genesis chapter 4. As we start to do this, Genesis chapter 4. So you know that Adam and Eve ended up having two sons, Cain and Abel. Now Cain was the firstborn. And the way that it generally goes is the firstborn son is going to be the one who carries your lineage forward. But you know the story of what ends up happening with Cain and Abel. God has them offer sacrifices to him. God accepts Abel's offering, but he rejects Cain's. Cain gets jealous, so he kills his brother Abel. Now the consequence of him doing that, killing Abel, God banishes Cain. So Cain, even though he is set to carry the lineage forward, since he's banished as part of his punishment, he's not going to carry the line forward. Well, Abel can't carry it forward because he's been murdered. So what's going to happen? Well, Genesis 4, look at verse number 25. And Adam knew his wife again, and she bore a son and called his name Seth, for she said, God has appointed for me another offspring instead of Abel, for Cain killed him. God blesses Adam and Eve with Seth. And the name Seth, it's interesting, it means another or a substitute. And that's what she even says here, God has blessed me with another. Cain has been banished. He's not going to carry on the lineage. Abel would have, but he was murdered, so God gives Seth. Seth now is next in line. He carries this lineage forward. So go to chapter 5, Genesis chapter 5. In Genesis 5, what you have is a long genealogical list of names. I want you to see verse 6. Seth is the one who's mentioned here that we need to notice. Verse 6, when Seth lived 105 years, he fathered Enosh. Now you can continue to read here. It goes on and gives you all these lists of names of so-and-so fathered so-and-so and fathered so-and-so on down the line until you go to verse 28. Verse 28, we start to be introduced to somebody that we're familiar with. Look at verses 28 and 29. When Lamech had lived 182 years, he fathered a son and called his name Noah, saying, out of the ground that the Lord has cursed, this one shall bring us relief from our work and from the painful toil of our hands. So now we've traced this seed line from Adam all the way here, finally, to Noah. Now, Noah ends up having 3 sons. If you look at verse 32, it says, after Noah was 500 years old, Noah fathered Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Okay, so of those 3 sons of Noah, I wonder, who's going to carry the lineage forward? Well, the answer is Shem. And the reason for that is because Shem is the firstborn. That's the general rule here. If you're the firstborn son, you're the one next in line to carry this seed line to Christ forward. So it's interesting. We know the story of Noah. God was going to flood the whole world. He tells Noah to build the ark and all this. But here's the thing. If for some reason Noah himself didn't make it on the ark, if he didn't get on the ark and he drowned in the waters, as long as Shem was on the ark and survived, the seed line was safe. If for some reason, God forbid, Noah didn't do it, things would have still been okay. This lineage would have still been preserved so long as Shem, made it onto the ark, right? So now let's fast forward a little bit to Genesis chapter 11. Genesis chapter 11. Look at verse number 10. Genesis 11 gives us another genealogical list, but it starts with Shem. Genesis chapter 11, verse 10, these are the generations of Shem. When Shem was 100 years old, he fathered Arphaxad 2 years after the flood. Now, of course, you can continue to read there, and it gives you all these different names of this guy fathered so-and-so, who fathered so-and-so, on down the list it goes. But go to verse 26. Here is another famous Bible character that this genealogy brings us to. Verse 26 says, when Terah had lived 70 years, he fathered Abram, Nahor, and Haran. We're introduced to this man named Terah and his 3 sons. Now again, of these 3 sons, who's going to carry this line forward? Well, obviously it's probably going to be the firstborn son, Abram, or as we better know him as Abraham. Now that wasn't his name to begin with. His name at first was Abram. Later on, God changed his name, of course, to Abraham. So now we've traced it to Abraham. Now Abraham is an interesting character because God, in the course of time, comes to Abraham and tells Abraham, I want you to leave your father and your home country, and I want you to go to Canaan's land and live there. Because one day, your descendants are going to own this land. Because I'm going to bring a great nation of people from you. How's God going to bring a great nation of people from Abraham? Because when God was making all those promises to Abraham, Abraham didn't have any children. He didn't have a son. Well, God promises Abraham eventually. He says, you're going to have a son. You and your wife, Sarah, will have a son. Now, that doesn't seem like too big of a promise for God to fulfill, right? But when God told Abraham and Sarah that, they were both old. So what ends up happening is God makes them wait to have their son. And in the process of waiting, they get impatient. Sarah doesn't get pregnant. So Sarah finally suggests to Abraham, she says, obviously I'm not getting pregnant. Why don't you take my servant Hagar and have a son with her? So Abraham does. Abraham and Hagar have a son, Ishmael. And Abraham thinks, okay, I had a son. This must be the son that God promised me. God comes to Abraham and says, well, no, I didn't just simply promise you that you'd have a son. I promised you you would have a son with Sarah. So it's not going to be Ishmael. So a little bit later they wait, and finally Sarah does get pregnant, and she gives birth to Isaac. Now Ishmael is Abraham's son, and he is the firstborn son, the first son that Abraham had. So you might think, well, he would carry the lineage on, but not in this instance. God says it's going to be Isaac who carries the lineage on because he was the son that I promised you. So one thing you're going to see as we go through this whole lineage is that that's the general rule. The firstborn carries it on, but God does step in at times and subvert that and say, we're going to do it different this time. It won't be the firstborn. That may be the general rule, but God makes exceptions to that at times. So who's going to carry on the line from Abraham? It's Isaac. Isaac carries it on. Well, Isaac ends up marrying a woman named Rebekah. Rebekah gets pregnant, and this kind of complicates things a little bit. She has twins, Jacob and Esau. Well, even if there's twins, the one who's born first, that's still the firstborn, right? Well, Esau comes out first. So he's the firstborn. And it's interesting because it says when he was born, he came out first, but Jacob had his hand wrapped around his leg. But he still came out first, so he counts as the firstborn, Esau. Well, as they grow up and get older, both of those boys end up kind of diversifying. Esau is a hunter. He goes out on a hunting trip one day, and he comes back, and he's famished. And here's Jacob cooking a stew. And Esau says to Jacob, I'm hungry. I feel like I'm about to die. Give me some of your stew. And Jacob says, I'll give you some of this stew, but you got to sell me your birthright. And now you would think Esau would say, no way. But Esau says, okay. You can read all this in Genesis chapter 25. Esau sells his birthright to Jacob. He says, why am I going to hold on to this birthright? It doesn't mean anything to me if I'm going to die. So what that essentially was, your birthright is it's your right to carry on the lineage. It's your right to be next in line. He sells that to Jacob. So now things are different. Jacob is going to be the one who carries the seed line forward. Now Jacob, as many of you probably know, he ends up having 12 sons. Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, Asher, Issachar, Zebulun, Joseph, and Benjamin. 12 sons. Say that 5 times fast. All those names. Okay, of which of those 12 sons now, which of them are going to carry on this seed line? You might think, if you're familiar with the names of these sons, you might think it's Reuben, because he's the firstborn. So you say, well, it's got to be Reuben. Nope, wasn't Reuben. You may think about it a little bit more, and you say, well, I bet it was Joseph. Because we're told that Joseph was Jacob's favorite son. And he didn't hide the fact that Jacob was his favorite son because he gave Joseph the coat of many colors. And all the other brothers got jealous of Joseph, and they ended up selling him as a slave just to get rid of him. And you know the story, what happened to Joseph. His brothers sell him as a slave. Those slave traders take him into Egypt, and over the course of time, he becomes second in command to Pharaoh. When a famine hits the land, Joseph, since he's a leader now, he saves the people from the famine. He prepares for it and saves the people. A lot of the book of Genesis towards the end really heavily focuses on Joseph. So I wouldn't blame you for thinking that it must be Joseph who's the chosen son to carry the lineage on. But it's not Joseph. Well, you say, well, who is it then? We got all these other sons. Who is it? Go to Genesis chapter 49. Genesis chapter 49, verse 10. Here's your answer. This is what Jacob says. Genesis 49, verse 10, he says, "The scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor the ruler's staff from between his feet until tribute comes to him, and he shall be the obedience of the peoples." The scepter will not depart from Judah. He's the chosen one. He's the one who's going to carry this forward. Now, you might be wondering, you say, well, why Judah? Why did he get chosen? Well, most likely he was chosen because you remember when the brothers were jealous of Joseph and they sold him as a slave, they actually wanted to kill him, is what they wanted to do. But Judah stepped in and said, no, let's not kill him. Spare his life. And that's when they decided, well, we'll at least get rid of him by selling him as a slave. So likely it was because Judah did noble things like that. And there were other times where he stepped in for his brother Benjamin and things like that. It's probably reasons like that that God said, you're going to carry it on. You've shown these good qualities. You'll be the one next in line. Now back in Genesis 38, we're told that Judah has a son. Judah and Tamar have a son named Pharez. You can read about that in Genesis 38. But what I want to do now is I actually want to take you to the book of Ruth. We're going to jump ahead a little bit to the book of Ruth. Judah has a son named Pharez. And in Ruth chapter 4, starting in verse 18, we pick up with the lineage of Judah's son Pharez. So Ruth chapter 4, look at verse 18. He says, "Now these are the generations of Pharez. Pharez fathered Hezron. Hezron fathered Ram. Ram fathered Abinadab. Abinadab fathered Nahshon. Nahshon fathered Salmon. Salmon fathered Boaz. Boaz fathered Obed. Obed fathered Jesse. And Jesse fathered David." So who do we come to now in this lineage? We finally come to King David. So let's think about what we've done. We've traced this lineage now from Adam all the way here now to King David. Now David is pretty significant. David wasn't the firstborn of his family. He was actually the runt of his family. But he's the one that God chose. God said, when I look at David and his heart, he's the one I want. Now who comes after David though? Because David himself had many sons. Well, it was Solomon. David's son Solomon was next in line, and he becomes king after David. You can read about that in 2 Samuel chapter 12, where God chooses Solomon. Now, Solomon wasn't David's firstborn son. If you look at all the sons that David had, Solomon was actually son number 10, actually, of the sons that David has. So again, God is subverting the normal thing of the firstborn in these instances. So we know Solomon carries it on, and he becomes king after David. And of course, we know Solomon being famous for being the wise king. He asked God for wisdom, and God gave it to him. Well, Solomon has a son, Rehoboam, and Rehoboam becomes king after him. And I'll just sum this up for you and make it really simple. If you go to 1 Chronicles chapter 3, from Solomon and his son Rehoboam, there's a whole line of kings that come after them, the kings of Judah. This seed line goes down the list of all those kings. So homework for you, if you want, you can read 1 Chronicles chapter 3 and read that line of kings that comes from Solomon. That's where this seed line to Christ continues down. It goes all the way down until you run into a man there named Zerubbabel. 1 Chronicles 3, eventually you'll run into a man named Zerubbabel. Okay? Keep that name in mind. Let's go on into the New Testament now. Let's go to Luke chapter 3. And we'll finally tie this into Jesus. Luke chapter 3. Look at verse 23. Luke chapter 3, verse 23. Jesus, when he began his ministry, was about 30 years of age, being the son, as was supposed, of Joseph, the son of Heli, the son of Mattat, the son of Levi, the son of Melchi, the son of Janai, the son of Joseph, the son of Matthias, the son of Amos, the son of Nahum, the son of Elisai, the son of Nagai, the son of Math, the son of Matthias, the son of Simon, the son of Josech, the son of Joda, the son of Jonan, the son of Rasha, the son of Zerubbabel. That's where we left off there in the Old Testament, 1 Chronicles 3, Zerubbabel. So here in Luke chapter 3, Luke traces Jesus' genealogy all the way back there to the Old Testament to guys like Zerubbabel. So now we have traced this seed line from Adam all the way down here now finally to Jesus. Now let me make a couple comments here if you're reading Luke chapter 3. You notice in Luke 3 that it traces this genealogy. Like we read to verse 27, Zerubbabel. It traces it up to Joseph. Now you might stop and say, well, hold on a minute now. Joseph was not actually Jesus' father, because remember, Jesus was born of the Virgin Mary. So why in the world is Luke tracing Jesus' genealogy up through Joseph when Joseph was not even his biological father? Well, there's a couple things you got to keep in mind. It's true Joseph was not Jesus' biological father, but he was still his father. He was his adopted father. And as far as the Jews were concerned, an adopted father was just as much a legitimate father as your biological one. And if you were an adopted son, you carried the lineage on. Yeah, but he doesn't have your blood in his veins. It don't matter. He is still part of your family. As far as God and all of them were concerned, that carries the lineage on. But for some people, that may not be good enough. Some people say, well, I don't like that. I want to know that Jesus has the blood of Zerubbabel and David and Abraham and all these people. I want to know that Jesus is biologically tied to this seed line. And it's not good enough for me to know that he's just adopted into it. Well, he does have the blood of all them in his veins. Let me tell you something interesting about this genealogy here in Luke chapter 3. In Luke 3, verse 23, it says this is the genealogy of Joseph. But the reality of it is this is actually most likely Mary's genealogy. The name Joseph is put there in place of Mary. And there's a reason for that. Amongst the Jewish people, if you were going to trace your wife's genealogy, you would often put her husband's name in her place. And the reason they did that in Hebrew thinking, well, he's the head of her family. Her husband's the head of the family, so you would often put the husband's name there in place of the wife. So that's actually most likely what's going on. And in verse 23, when it says Joseph, the son of Heli, that's actually Mary's dad. So Joseph is being put here in place of Mary. So this is actually technically Mary's genealogy. Joseph is just put there in place of her name, if that makes sense. So what have we learned from all this? We followed this seed line all the way from Adam to Jesus. Why did I tell you this? I'm not sharing this with you because I just want to give you some interesting Bible facts. Bible trivia. Did you know there's a seed line of Jesus in the Bible, right? I want you to see this because there's some important things we need to learn. The story of the Old Testament is the story of a seed line. That's what it is. It is the story of this lineage that's going to bring about the Messiah. And all the Old Testament stories that we know of, like Noah's Ark, Moses leading the Israelites out of Egypt, Moses taking them to Mount Sinai, King David and all the things that he had, all of those stories revolve around that seed line. All the stories of the Old Testament have to do with what God did to bring about, protect, and guide this lineage that was going to bring the Messiah. That's what the whole Old Testament is about, essentially. Now, you may think this. You may wonder to yourself, well, why did God even go through this long lineage to bring Jesus? Why didn't he bring Jesus earlier? Or why not just bring Jesus at the very beginning when Adam and Eve sinned? Just cut the whole seed line thing out. Adam and Eve sinned. Bring Jesus there right then to be the sacrifice for them and just take care of it then and there. Well, Galatians chapter 4, verse 4. Paul says that in the fullness of time, God sent forth his Son born of a woman. Jesus was born in the fullness of time, or in other words, Jesus was born when the time was right. The time wasn't right for Jesus to come earlier than when he did. Why not? Well, here's the fact of the matter, folks. Before God just sent Jesus to this world, he wanted to get people ready for it. People needed to learn a few things before Jesus got here. I mean, you wouldn't take a newborn infant and try to teach them advanced math. You wouldn't do that because you know they're not ready for it. There's things they need to learn before they try to handle advanced math. They need to learn their ABCs and 1, 2, 3s first. What's the same concept with humanity? Before God just throws Jesus at us, there are some things he wants people to know. God, throughout this history of a genealogy, he takes time to teach people, hey, this is sin. This is why sin is bad. This is how sin hurts you. And you remember he gave the Israelites a law, the law of Moses. That was a very big law. There were hundreds of commands in that law, and none of those Israelites, I don't care how holy they thought they were, none of them kept that law perfectly. God gave a law that was overwhelming and that could not be kept perfectly. Why would God do that? To teach the people, you need a Savior. You can't be perfect. You can't live up to my holy standard. And that's not what I'm asking. I'm showing you that you need a Savior. He taught people what sin was, and he showed them their need of salvation. All of that through this whole centuries of genealogy, so that way when Jesus got here, they would be ready. Now, let me also say this. This is an interesting thing. When Jesus was born, here's another reason why him being born when he was born was the right time. When he was born, who was in charge of the ancient world? You say, well, it was the Romans. You remember in the whole story of the birth of Jesus, the reason that Mary and Joseph were traveling to Bethlehem is because it says Caesar sent out a decree that there was going to be a census and everybody needed to go back to their homeland in order to be counted in that census. So Caesar, or the Romans, was in charge of the ancient world at that time. Now here's why that's important. Before Rome came and took over everything, the ancient world was very tribal and very divided into all these individual kingdoms. You had Babylonians here, Philistines here, and Ammonites here, and they didn't get along with each other. And if you were a Philistine, you better not cross over into Ammonite territory or we're going to fight. Traveling around was kind of difficult back in those days. Everything was very divided up. But Rome came in and took over all of it. So it was all under one authority of Rome. So now, traveling's much easier. I don't have to worry near as much about whose territory is what. Rome rules over it all. And Romans also built very advanced road systems, some of you may know. And Romans, say what you will about them, they did a lot to clean up the sea. Before Rome took charge, you really couldn't sail because the sea was so full of pirates that if you tried to sail, you probably weren't going to make it back. It was really dangerous. Well, the Romans cleaned that up, and they made sailing much easier. So why am I saying all this to you? Well, when Jesus was born, when Rome ruled, he was born, and he came, and he lived, and he died, and he gave the world some good news that he wanted spread. And now that Rome was in charge, stuff could spread very quickly now. If you had a message that you wanted to get out to the world, it could spread like never before in history now. And when you go to the book of Acts and you read like the missionary journeys of Paul and others, and you see all the places where he was traveling and sailing to and all this stuff, that was all thanks to Rome. And you read the book of Acts, it's amazing how fast the gospel spread across that world. And I always think of Acts 17:6. I always liked this verse. In Acts 17:6, there were these Jews in Thessalonica. They saw what the Christians were doing, and they pointed to those Christians and they said, "These are the people who are turning the world upside down." Their message is spreading so fast, and they are changing things so quickly. And a lot of that was thanks to Rome. So Jesus being born when he was born, that was really the first time in history where that could actually be possible. God knew what he was doing when he waited to send Jesus when he did, is what I'm saying. So let me give you some summary thoughts here, and I'll let you go. I wonder, when God was bringing about Jesus, as this lineage was progressing, I wonder to myself about how many people there were in the world who had no clue what God was doing. They had no clue God was at work bringing about a Messiah, that there was this seed line that was progressing. They had no clue. They're just living their lives, doing what they want to do, making money, having fun. We know today what God was up to because God has revealed that to us in Scripture. God has shown us that's what I was doing throughout human history, bringing about Jesus. I think to myself now, how many people are there here today who know what God did and they still don't care? They didn't care when they didn't know. Now that we do know, there's still so many people who don't care. What we need to take away from this ultimately is God did all of that for you and me. Jesus, Mary, and the manger, that was just the finishing touches on a plan that God had been working out ever since the creation of this world. God did all that work, took all this time, labored through all this seed line of genealogy to bring Jesus because he wanted to save us. And you know what God is asking of you? He's not asking you to do all the work. He's telling you, I've done the work for you. All you need to do, all I'm asking, is that you receive this as a gift. All the work throughout all these centuries that I labored to do, the work of salvation, it's been done. I did it. You just receive it as a free gift. I don't know why anybody wouldn't want that. God's not demanding perfection from you. God is not demanding that you just become a totally different person and you just be perfect and you never mess up ever again in your life. God is saying, accept my son, accept my gift to you, and I'll change your heart. I'll work with you. I'll be with you. I'll give you my grace. I'll give you my mercy, my understanding, and my compassion. That's a good deal, y'all. That is a good deal, and I'm going to take him up on it, and I want others to take God up on that. Let's recognize what God has done for us, all the work that he's put in to bring Christ for us. Appreciate that and give our hearts to him. Now, if you're here this morning and you have yet to do that, we want you to know that you can give yourself to Christ. You can place your faith in him. You can be baptized and have your sins forgiven and walk that new life. And if you're here and you say, I've done that, I am a Christian, but I feel like my faith has grown weak and I need help. Hey, we're not here to judge you. We're just here to help you. If there's a need you have, whatever way, we can help you. Let it be known while together we stand and while we sing.